So I just wanted to say that it's been really fun to work on this exhibition for over a year now, which is incredibly fast as exhibitions are and publications are put together. But now we're at the finish line with a beautiful display, and the last time I spoke on this topic, there wasn't the opportunity to look at all these great art pieces. So now, as Eileen mentioned, the museum will be open an hour afterwards, so please take advantage of the time to look through the exhibition, enjoy all the great artwork, and wander around. So the topic I've chosen to speak on, fantasy and fiction in Russell's art, is one that is truly rich and has a wealth of connections that hasn't even been all covered or mined in this catalog that we have or in the exhibition itself. So I'm just going to go through and present a few little glimpses that I've come across in my research, speaking on Russell's artistic influences and his depictions of women within the wider cultural trends of turn-of-century America, as well as some of the interesting connections between women, the women in his life, Russell and the women in his life, and the books that he read and illustrated. So I thought I'd begin with two of my favorite images of Russell, dressed in drag at his home in Cascade and also at Bullhead Lodge. I should say, too, that he's not the first artist I've come across that took liberties with costume play. The Ashcan artists from New York, including Everett Shin and John Sloan, also dressed up and conducted plays and had fun performances too. So I suspect it wasn't unusual to play around with gender roles, just in case you thought the depiction of him was a little wacky. Russell is in good company with other artists who do similar types of things with their friends, and that image of Russell too is right through that window if you want a really big image of it to look at. But again, both pictures here, I want to talk about Russell's attitude of play. The physical act of role-playing is intimately connected with the body as it is with the imagination. Here we see Russell as the jester, the entertainer, the man so intimately comfortable with himself that he had no issues inhabiting the clothes, persona, or role of another. At heart, Russell is a performer, as his cousin Fergus Mead once described, quote, "Charlie was a bit of a grandstander," or to put it more gently, that he had a good deal of the theatrical in him. He certainly insisted in dressing the part whenever he was in the East, with his high-heeled boots, his big Stetson, and his sash, all of which was good business, but not very hard for Charlie to do, unquote. And we see this with all of his personalities: Kid Russell, the cowboy artist, Rawhide Rollins, the old-time raconteur, and Awakasi, the white Indian. So while he plied his reputation as a self-taught artist, Russell was by no means an isolated savant. Like many of his professional peers, he kept himself informed as to the artistic movements, conventional styles, and techniques of his day through reading, travel, visual study, and communication with other artists. In turn, this diverse environment shaped his portrayals of women, bringing elements of the mythic, the exotic, and the fictional into his art. And so here, next up, is a great posed photo of one of Nancy's friends from Cascade, Nell Johnson Gorham, with Russell's guitar, which is on display from our studio collection. She perhaps was an inspiration for his work. So Russell sometimes worked with friends as live models or with Nancy. However, more often than not, he relied on photography to take images of them captured and dressed like this and used later for his works. Or even instead, he often turned to sculpting to create clay and plaster models, which he then used shining light on them to turn 3D dimensional works into 2D. But again, this photo is just a great reference to show his close associations and shared friendships with women that he had throughout his life. So who knows, perhaps she may have been an inspiration for the work up here, My Valentine, circa 1890, of a girl playing a bullback mandolin, which was painted for Leela Roberts, another of Russell's and Nancy's friends, to raise funds at a church social in Cascade. You can see here the neoclassical references that Russell brings out, the additions of putti or cherub figures, references to spring. The seasons were often given a female personification and association with mythology, and through the mandolin. The mandolin gained considerable popularity with amateur musicians in the 1890s, along with the guitar and the banjo, both of which were owned and played by Russell. So advertisements and journals of the era sought to market the mandolin as a refined, highbrow instrument associated with female sensuality and visual allusions to classicism. The mandolin was also prominent in reference to an Aesop fable, which you can see in the Bridgman painting right there. The Aesop fable was titled The Ant and the Grasshopper, or the Cicada. And this fable juxtaposed the virtues of hard work with the consequences of idle pleasures. So the grasshopper had all the fun all summer singing, but he suffers in the winter, while the industrious ant, who stockpiles food and prepares for the hardships to come, is more prepared. So it was popularly depicted by artists in the late 19th century, such as the French academicians here, Leon Basile Perrault and Edward Besson, as well as the American Frederick Arthur Bridgman. Works that, again, reminded me a bit of My Valentine. Also on this slide, I have a little female figure sculpted in plaster right here that is holding and playing a lute. And I think it was made as a bottle stopper or plug. And this is just a really early figurine that reinforces, again, the classical theme up here, and that Russell's works from the 1880s and 90s really took advantage of. Another popular neoclassical motif for artists, writers, and poets in the 19th century were Greek goddesses, among them Venus and Psyche. So Psyche was the wife of Cupid, who himself was the son of Venus. Psyche's name in ancient Greek translates as butterfly and refers to the human soul. Thus in art, Psyche is commonly represented with butterfly wings to convey the lightness of the soul. To me, Russell's wood nymph fits this motif. You can see her lifting a little flower to a nearby butterfly as she's arrayed in this gossamer garment and is sporting a delicate pair of butterfly wings as she perches atop this, very fairy tale, fairy-esque, nymph-like tree and scene. And so this work was actually also originally part of the Mint Bar collection. And you can just see to the left of it a few other works that artists depict Psyche as. And so the artist's early inspiration deriving from mythological and classical figures also makes an easy transition, as we can see, into the realm of fantasy, where gnomes, nymphs, and fictional characters are sprung to life in later works. Here we see two of Russell's plaster models of nymphs, one which he gave his neighbor Josephine Trigg in 1920, and the other, which served as a wax candle holder, remained in Nancy's possession. Both models are painted in tones of brown and green, depict a nude female sitting on a rocky outcropping with one leg extended and drawn up. So these flowing Beaux Arts inspired works share similarities to these elaborate illustrations by Arthur Rackham, which you can see as well, whose depictions of fairies and gnomes gained popularity through the distribution of deluxe volumes by prominent authors such as Washington Irving, the Rip Van Winkle, you can see there, and J.M. Barrie as well. He also did Peter Pan and other such novels. So in 1916 as well, Josephine Trigg presented Russell with a 1905 Rackham illustrated copy, and Rackham had been described as, quote, the leading decorative illustrator of the Edwardian period, unquote. So Russell's fondness for Rip Van Winkle and nymphs and fairies can be traced also, as we can see, to this early 1898 dinner placard where he depicts Rip Van Winkle. So again, just references to books and magical characters and that Russell was interested in and shows through in his art and personal works to friends. Moving back into the mythological, we can perhaps derive another source of Russell's artistic inspirations in his own backyard, the Mint Bar and Saloon in Great Falls, which opened in 1898 under D.C. Doolan and was later acquired by Sid Willis, whose famous collection of Russell art was purchased for the Aaron Carter Museum and now has since spread to other public and private collections. But looking at this interior photograph, featured in Tribune magazine in 1899, and there's a later version of the Mint Bar, which if you came into this gallery, you'd be able to see right on that wall down there. But you can see here, again, it shows a replica of a statue titled Venus with the Apple by Danish artist Berthold Thorvaldsen in the middle of the bar, and a wonderful modesty curtain that surrounds it, along with what appears to be hanging above it, an image of a buffalo hunt, which may or may not be, but I say it looks quite similar to Russell's Buffalo Hunt number 22 that was painted in 1898. However, regardless of whether it is not that same scene, the fun juxtaposition I think that exists there between male virility and feminine charm is what historian Elliot West referred to as Victorian macho. And it was a popular decoration scheme in Western bars, which you can still see today. Even if you go into the Stein House, you can see, women nudes as well as Western scenes there. So it comes from a legitimate tradition, hearkening to the past. But again, what I think is really fun about that pairing and just thinking about it is that both works of art intertwine and romanticize the concepts of beauty and death. So we have the agility, speed, and visual display of American Indians hunting bison, a dead tradition by 1898, but an image that invokes nostalgia. And then you have Venus here holding the apple of discord, recalling the temptation of Eve and foreshadowing the judgment of Paris and the major battle between the Greeks and the Trojans over Helena of Troy. So in the 19th century, academic fine arts training often did include instruction in drawing from the antique, a practice in which plaster cast copies of classical marble sculptures, much like the work there, were arranged in classrooms for students to draw from. So Russell's brief and only stint in arts training was spent this way, though he gave it up after only a few sessions, frustrated by his teacher's lack of instruction. And so this comes from Nancy's unpublished biography of Russell, in which is quoted, quote, "The instructor sets up a plaster foot and tells the class to draw it. I did. When he came around to me, he'd say, 'That won't do, try again.' He would not tell me what was wrong. I have drawn that foot for 3 mornings. Whatever is the matter with it, I don't know. So I'm through," unquote. So that was Russell, again, fed up with academics. But his exposure, again, to this practice of plaster cast drawing may have led him to use this statue as a body model for both wood nymph and for Indian maiden braiding her hair. And so here again, you can see, I'll just point out the great abs and body she has, and also similar ab and body structure there as well. But so while Russell's mythological females are painted in the bloom of youth and placed in nature's landscape, so too are his Indian maidens. In the work Indian Maiden Braiding Her Hair, these two categories visibly merge as Russell shifts the portrayal of erotic desire from white women to American Indians. And we begin to visually equate an idealized primitive natural world and its beauty with that of Native Americans, who were placed in juxtaposition to Anglo-Europeans. And one artist who really shows this equation between nature's beauty and Native people is Alfred Jacob Miller, whose works are to the left. Miller was an artist out of Baltimore who was living in New Orleans when he was invited by the Scottish nobleman William Drummond Stewart to attend the annual fur trade at the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous near Green River, Wyoming, as the expedition's artist. So they made the journey up there to Wyoming in 1837, and upon his return to Baltimore, Miller spent the rest of his career painting scenes from this trip. And I'll just go on to tell you Miller's description of this painting, Indian Toilette, which emphasizes women's reliance on nature to fulfill their beauty needs. Quote, Fertile in expedience, the females find a substitute in nature. Posed on the borders of a quiet stream, they may be seen watching the reflection of their dusky charms, and using bear's grease, they smooth their elfin locks of coarse raven black hair. Unquote. And so these next two paintings as well show the different depictions of toilette scenes or bathing. Although the Sargent portrait to the right lacks pictorial context, it isn't quite clear, but you can see the idea in both this witnessing of an intimate feminine ritual. The artist gives the viewer cover to look at this taboo scene that would be normally judged as improper or immoral by the era standards by disguising the female, turning her either into a mythological being like Aurora on the left, or by painting her into a different ethnicity. You can see this a life study of an Egyptian girl on the right. So both Lowe and Sargent's paintings were shown at the World's Fair Columbian Exhibition in 1893, which Russell did attend, so he may have seen them there. And Lowe's work was also on display in the Met Museum at the time period, and Tiffany's, as you can see in the middle, produced a stained glass copy of the work. And Tiffany's was also a broker of Russell's sculptures in New York, so he would have gone in there and could have possibly seen this work on view. I also want to mention that many prominent artists of the period, including William Merritt Chase, John Singer Sargent, and John Joseph Benjamin Constant, decorated and arranged their studios in an eclectic style to feature their personal collections of ethnic and exotic cultural objects like Japanese folding screens, umbrellas, ceramics, and rugs, which often doubled as props for their paintings. Likewise, Russell did the same with his studio. His collection contained objects from various North American tribes, the Plains, Southwest Indians, the Inuit in Canada, as well as objects from West Africa, China, and the Philippines. So these artist studios became an outward extension of their interest in other cultures and countries, and in the subject matter that dominated many of their paintings. And in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see a little pen and ink sketch by Russell from around 1896 titled Contrast in the Artist Salons, My Studio as My Mother Thought, which give you Russell's take on a fine artist studio of the period, which draws this, again, eclectic collecting tradition and prop collection owned in. You can see also it introduces, I don't know if you can see it very well, but the painting that the artist has just started to produce is an Oriental scene. And so again, this concept of Orientalism is swirling in all these artist studios and in their paintings of the time. So as we saw previously by paintings by Miller and Russell, Native American women and images of them were classified as exotic within the context of European and American cultural discourse and were frequently sexualized in the arts and literature of the period, alongside women from the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, because of their racial heritage, darker skin tone, and non-Eurocentric culture, rather than because of any intrinsic qualities associated with the women themselves. These stereotypes forged a link between exoticism and erotic appeal that became enshrined in one of the major art movements of the 19th century, Orientalism. So here in both Renoir and Russell's works, we can find similarities in the female's gaze as it confronts the viewer, who was often assumed male. So you see in their face and the presentation of their bodies this tension between a sensual invitation and a type of feminine challenge to male desire. Another seductive woman of similar pose to Keoma is the fictional Indian maiden here, Minnehaha, or Laughing Water, seen in Russell's 1903 work, Hiawatha's Wooing. Minnehaha lies at the center of an epic poem that blends indigenous American characters with allusions to classical myth. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's The Song of Hiawatha, written in 1855, was one of the most popular American poems of the 19th century. The poem spurred a number of paintings and had an important presence in popular media. The prolific printers, Currier and Ives, produced 7 colored lithographs of the poem between 1858 and 1868, which were widely circulated. And a similar composition can also be seen here in the photograph by James Landy titled "Suddenly from Out the Woodlands, Hiawatha Stood Before Them," which won first place in a Longfellow competition in 1888 held in Minneapolis. And so I think most striking between especially the photograph down below and Russell's work is this paused theatricality seen in Hiawatha's gesture and in the disconnected gazes of the figures. So instead of the apple that Venus held, we also have the offering of the dead deer here, possible foreboding of Minnehaha's tragic death as she deliriously jumps from a waterfall with Hiawatha's name on her lips. Scholar Rose M. Davis notes that Minnehaha's death is in keeping with Edgar Allan Poe's assessment that the most poetical of all topics is the death of a beautiful woman, which is great. But again, just another one of these 19th century physical and poetic allusions to women as beautiful possessions, or, just sort of their vulnerability, I should say, that's really, emphasized again and again. And so the mammoth staging of the world's fairs in the 19th century and early 20th were some of the largest centralized displays of international cultural achievement and acted as catalysts for Orientalism's spread in wider American culture. Two of the most prominent fairs were the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago and the 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, which celebrated westward expansion. Russell again attended both of these fairs. And here, progress is not only demonstrated through exhibitions commemorating a unified, predominantly white nation, but by juxtaposition reinforced by the fair's anthropology buildings and carnival-esque grounds, dubbed the Midway in Chicago and the Pike in St. Louis. So these specific areas were designed to provide educational entertainment on exotic and so-called primitive cultures, featuring live ethnographic exhibitions. So you can see that these images here show the staging of the attraction, the Streets of Cairo, at the World's Fairs. And a description of the staging in Chicago speaks to this realistic experience that visitors would encounter. Quote, "Architecturally, the street, long and winding, was perfectly reproduced. The shops were real shops, not mere exhibits, and it required only American money. The attendants were Egyptians, and the real citizens of Cairo lived in the upper stories of the houses and loitered or hurried through the streets, jostling and touching the cosmopolitan guests and sightseers. Donkeys and camels were steeds and vehicles. From an open door came the music of an Oriental theater, and from the balcony hung a girl of sunny Egypt, preceded by a waving sword and escorted by many guests. A bride rode camelback to the temple, up and down the thoroughfare, in and out." So again, this is something that they're trying to really create this sort of Disneyland experience where you go in and really meet the characters, and it's this whole orchestrated performance for everyone. And so, again, a cartoon titled Human Nature, which ran at Puck Magazine during the 1893 exposition, sort of satirizes the connection between Orientalism and voyeuristic male audiences that frequented the exotic stage performances of female dancers. So this before and after drawing illustrates this dramatic rise in male visitors when the faux attraction changes its headline from life in Holy Land, scenes from biblical days, to life in the harem, dreamy scents in Orient, Eastern dancers, and the Sultan's diversions. So clearly that one got more attention from the men. But again, you can just see that the atmosphere in the country at the time was ripe for these paintings and images of Oriental women and other types of scenes. If you look at the architectural elements between this photograph of the World's Fairs exhibits and Russell's painting Street Scene with Arabia, you can see perhaps some of these photographs or personal experiences he had may have been derived as visual sources for him. Another possible inspiration for Russell's Arabian figures was the work of Mortimer Mempes, an Australian painter and etcher, who made his home in England and was a pupil and studio assistant of James McNeill Whistler. For Christmas in 1903, Russell's father gifted Russell a travelogue centering on India and Arab cultures titled The Durbar, written by Mempi's daughter and illustrated by her father. From 1902 to 1917, Dorothy and Mortimer Mempi's traveled, visiting Japan, India, Mexico, Burma, Morocco, and Egypt, producing illustrated books of the countries they visited, like the Durbar. And so I think when you look at Russell's paintings and that of Mortimer Mempi's, you can kind of see some similarities perhaps in the softer palette of the colors and the types of figures that can be seen in both their works featuring Oriental scenes. And as we may all know, one of Russell's most important early models was Nancy Russell herself. Here we have two great photographs of her dressed in pseudo-Arabian attire. These were taken at her home, right here at Great Falls, on their settee in the front entry room of the parlor, telling from the wallpaper. But this photo shoot could have been inspired by any number of things. The book, 1001 Arabian Nights, Twain's famous Innocents Abroad, which helped propel America's interests in the Orient, either of the world's fairs or perhaps an event closer in their own backyard. So in an email exchange with Byron Price, he shared with me this news clipping from the Great Falls Tribune from 1901 in July. So for a stretch of 6 days in July 8th through 13th, the Great Falls businessmen, quote, secured the presence of the world-renowned attractions and Oriental splendors put together by the George Jabbour Oriental Circus and Menagerie Company, who helped produce attractions at the Midway and the World's Fairs in Chicago with the goal to reproduce the Midway in Montana. George Jabbour was from Constantinople. He traveled to Chicago to work at the fair in 1893 and then moved to New York City, where he set up shows at Coney Island in Brooklyn. He was run out of New York due to the risque nature of his acts and shows, but he decided to take his show on the road and built up a traveling carnival and circus company, which operated from 1901 to 1904 before again falling into bankruptcy. But this 6-day carnival in Great Falls, and also traveled to Butte and then on to Seattle. But it had 10 separate shows with 2 performances a day. It had a Midway type section, a Streets of Cairo, an Oriental theater, and then also a Mexican theater, Algerian theater, German village, animal show, and lunette and projectoscope. The newspaper states, in its description of the streets of Cairo, quote, "In this labyrinth maze of winding ways will be seen 100 real Egyptians and Arabian people, men and women in their native costumes from the Nile that have felt the scorching desert sands, people who have faced the fierce Harmattan winds and were soothed to repose by the gentle siroccoes that blew from the Lydian shores. They have scaled the pyramids and marveled at the foot of the Sphinx. These weird people will daily give an exhibition of the manners and customs of their countrymen. Their women will illustrate the theme of the Egyptian home life. They will tell fortunes by the stars and by other methods known only to the mystic arts of these descendants of the ancient pharaohs," unquote. So some really good marketing copy there. And the reporter also goes on to describe the Oriental Theater, which will host, quote, "a coterie of houris, or beautiful young women who make up virgins in Muslim paradise, whose dark skin and darker eyes are fascinating as they twinkle like the stars newly flung from the hands of the Creator," unquote. Yeah, pretty exciting. So maybe that was her inspiration. But here you can see at the bottom where La Belle Fatima and her world-famous troupe of muscle dancers, which included Freda, Rosa, Omina, and Sultana, will perform the Hoochie Coochie. So that is a traditional Arabian dance, if you weren't aware. But, you know, it's sort of fun that, you know, stuff like this traveled, of course, to Great Falls. You know, we were right on the train station and very cosmopolitan in the shows and the events that we had. So it's just exciting to see that type of stuff. And if you want your own taste, please visit our mutoscope in the Imagined Women section of the exhibition. Here, inspired by this Hoochie Coochie dance, we have a clip from the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair where Princess Raja does a little dance and swings a chair with her teeth. So it's a very fun educational element that we've added. You should all check out. But again, having been expressed through the words of authors, the canvases of painters, the lenses of photographers, and the stages of play actors, it was only natural as well that the film industry would take on the subject of Orientalism. And Russell himself was a film lover. He frequented the cinema with Jody Young in Great Falls. And in the 1920s, he went to Southern California and began hobnobbing with the Hollywood crowd, developing relationships with early stars like Tom Mix, Will Rogers, Harry Carey, Douglas Fairbanks, and others. So the two Russell works we show here feature an exotic Egyptian women, resemble in appearance various fictional characters, including the biblical Salome, the historical Cleopatra, and the fictional character in Gustave Flaubert's novel Salammbô. And one of the film actresses who was famous in her day, who played both Cleopatra and Salome, was Theda Bara, an iconic silent film actress who worked at Fox from 1915 to 1919. So she had a reputation as a vamp and a vixen, and Fox built up, again, her mysterious appeal, saying her first name was an anagram that spelt death, and her last name read backwards was Arab, and that she was born in the Sahara Desert in the shadow of the Sphinx, which certainly was not true. I think she's from Middle America. But again, you know, this mystique that they're creating for her. And actually, these two films, Cleopatra and Salome, were two of her biggest hits and ran in cinemas across the nation and had plays from the films that traveled around town as well. And so another connection, again, that we could make between Russell's figures is the epic film production, The Ten Commandments, which ran in films in 1923, actually the same time as that little Egyptian wax plaster sculpture was created. So this was directed by Cecil DeMille, and the desert scenes were filmed on the California beach line about 70 miles out of Santa Barbara, where Russell was staying. And in a 1926 illustrated letter to his neighbor Josephine Trigg, Russell writes, quote, "A few years ago you might have seen Moses and his bunch heading for the sea, somewhere between Long Beach and Santa Barbara. Maybe they had harps, but if they played, it was jazz music, the same you'll hear at the Odan or Meadowlark Club. Moses is here yet. I saw him the other day. I don't know what he's doing now, but it's a safe bet he can't write the Ten Commandments," unquote. So, you know, Russell may have known DeMille himself, who also shot a number of Western films. Again, he from that quote letter, we think that, you know, he was on set, perhaps, for this staging, which is pretty exciting. Now we'll take a left turn into some of Russell's bread and butter trade, his Western illustrations. And so I just want to show you in this slide here Russell's attention that he always paid to women's fashion, which we can see in inklings of even the earliest drawings from the 1880s. That sketch up there, Dudes, was drawn especially for this woman named Eddie Belton. But you can see on her feet, prominently shown are these great heels, and you know, her fashion she's laid out, and she really wanted her depiction to show her sense of fashion, so Russell made sure to do that. And again, it just shows you know, he carries this attention to detail using his prop collection throughout his work. And another illustration down here of Hope Hathaway, she's wearing this split riding skirt, which by 1905 had become a standard uniform for ranch women. By unbuttoning the front panel, a woman could easily ride astride like a man and perform ranch chores. But when she dismounted, the front panel of the skirt could be buttoned up to achieve a more ladylike appearance when she was strolling down through the town. So I do believe Nancy owned one of these skirts that we have in the collection, but on view in the galleries instead, we have a nice linen riding habit and a pair of jodhpurs that Nancy used along with her side saddle, which was a gift from Charlie prior to their marriage. So long after Nancy retired the saddle from use, he used it as a prop in several pen and ink sketches for illustrations, such as Owen Wister's The Virginian. For a 1911 commemorative edition of the Virginian, which was first written in 1902, that was by Owen Wister. It was commissioned 40 illustrations from Russell in addition to 9 color plates that would accompany the text from a then deceased Frederick Remington. But the first edition of the Virginian was illustrated by Arthur Ignatius Keller, who set the precedent for the visual portrayal of Molly Wood to exude a sense of helplessness and desperation in the face of a wild and rugged West, epitomized in his frontispiece, by his side, the girl walking and cheering him forward. And we can see here she leads the Virginian home after being told by him, quote, "You have got to be the man through all this mess," unquote. But here we see Wood, who appears as the nurturing force of civilization. She's smart, pulled together, and altogether proper, in contrast to the tattered Virginian, whose wild and unpredictable frontier life erodes under her influence. Written in response to the Virginian, a novel which apparently neither Russell nor Remington particularly liked, was Remington's own illustrated novel, John Ermine of the Yellowstone, which I thought made a good comparison image to Keller's. So Remington's image of his own book is on the far right. Remington's novel reflects the fears shared by men of the period, namely the loss of the frontier as a theater of masculinity. And Russell did read Remington's work, as there is a reference to the book in a note passed between Russell and DeYoung. One of the great art historians, critics, Alexander Nemerov, reads Remington's subtext of women as a threatening force, quote, "as toxic an emblem of civilization as any of the locomotives, steamboats, or telegraph wires that routinely allegorize the doom of the Old West in paintings of this era," unquote. So the only illustration of Catherine in the book that Remington wrote is this one, "He bore the limp form to the sands." And it shows her in a state of unconsciousness, knocked out by the landscape's hidden pitfalls. She is a visual embodiment of a damsel in distress, or allegorically, civilization wilted by the errant frontier, whose primitive strength rescues her from herself. Following in the wake of Keller and Remington, Russell's illustrations of Molly Wood, which you can see one of them in the middle, continue in this trend of vulnerable portrayal, drawing her sitting on her side saddle and staring in grief as she looks down on the Virginian's splayed out body. But neither horse seems unfazed, however, so that's a good sign. Perhaps Russell's foreshadowing of a happy ending, that the horses don't really care. Of course, if you read along in the book in the Virginian, Molly Wood redeems herself as a scrappy and resourceful woman, one no doubt remade by the vigor of Western life, her character tested and forged by the exciting and perilous situations she found herself teaching school in Wyoming and falling in love with a man who attracted a dangerous crowd. But as to witnessing these visuals of feminine distress, we can't be too surprised since the book, The Virginian, was written by a man. But now we can turn to a heartier tale of female strength in the face of adversity and see how much more interesting Russell's work is in a novel written by a woman. So here are one of Russell's illustrations for the book Hope Hathaway, A Story of Western Ranch Life. And they are some of his strongest depictions of a female protagonist subject because of the fidelity with which he captured the spirit, the independence, and empowerment embraced by a modern woman of the 20th century. Hope Hathaway is a young woman raised on a Montana ranch who is unafraid of confrontation as she runs headlong into adventure as a school teacher for a mixed-race family. In between teaching the children, she falls in love with a dashing sheep rancher and saves his livestock from a group of nearby cattle ranchers and rustlers who are angry over the introduction of sheep to the area. She is also very handy with a firearm and unafraid to shoot to wound, as this image of Russell shows here, which is pretty exciting. And so for this character, we have to thank little-known Western author Francis Parkman. In 1891, at 16, Frances Parker left her upper-class family at home in Detroit to live with her uncle in Wolf Point, Montana. Soon after, she met and married C.M. Jacobs, the foreman at the N-Bar End Cattle Ranch, where she lived until 1893 and likely first met Russell, who had worked in the similar area roundups. In 1893, Jacobs quit the ranch to raise sheep on a homestead that the couple purchased south of the Chinook and at the foot of the Bear Paw Mountains. By 1902, however, Parker had grown apart from her husband and her life in Montana, and she moved back permanently to Detroit, where her father still lived, and divorced Jacobs. And while she was in Detroit, she began writing, which centered on Western life. Parker's first novel, Margie of the Lower Ranch, did not pack the same writerly punch as would her second, and neither did their illustrations, as we can see here. A Boston illustrator, Victor A. Searles, was in charge of bringing Margie to life. His illustrations are awash in high romance and the look of an imaginary West. Clearly, he didn't have the lived experience that Russell did. In particular, the frontispiece titled "Marjorie was speeding rapidly across the prairie" shows neither prairie nor haste. A book reviewer from the period describes the picture thusly, quote, "Margie in a Red Riding habit on a horse twice as high as a big fir tree, galloping towards the spectator with a sun that fills nearly half the picture. It is both great and lurid." And so I'd say, yes, it's lurid indeed, not quite Western. And so maybe because of it or because of not of it, but the book didn't sell that well. And thankfully, for her second novel, she changed her tactics, creating a stronger female character with a more exciting plot, and choosing a true-to-life Western artist to do the illustrations, Charlie Russell. So a newspaper at the time credits Parker with taking a train ride all the way from Detroit to Great Falls to ask Russell in person to be the illustrator, and of course he agreed. Upon receiving Russell's drawings, Frances Parker said, quote, "I would cry, they are so intimately my own, made for me by my very good friend," unquote. So her strong reaction to them testifies to the degree to which the artist captured the character of Hope and in some ways of Parker herself. And now to close, we'll turn at last to Nancy, who in 1924 wrote in a letter to Ralph Budd, then president of the Great Northern Railway, that Russell, quote, "cannot draw a pretty girl or people into up-to-date clothing. But he does know the feel and the look and the romance of the West of yesterday, and known its people as well as its animals, their lives, and the magic that held them there," unquote. Nancy, of course, wrote that letter to protect Russell's integrity so that he would not have to paint trains and marketing advertisements for the railroad company, and could stick to subjects that he enjoyed. But if we look closely, we can see that Russell, in fact, knew how to paint a good-looking woman, even one in up-to-date Western duds, and from all the visual evidence we have of Hope Hathaway, she was one tough cookie, a real Western woman, much like Nancy Russell herself. So, thank you all for coming. Any questions? Graham must have done such a great job. I just covered everything so thoroughly. No, I'm just kidding. But again, thank you all for coming. We're still open for another hour and 15 minutes. Please walk through, peruse the exhibition. Look at all the great images. It's just such a treat to have them here. So thank you all for coming out tonight.